Hello, listener. It's 3:47 p.m. on Interstate 35 between Austin and Dallas, Texas. 206 miles of asphalt, carrying approximately 190,000 vehicles on an average Friday afternoon in August. Right now, at this exact moment, every single one of those vehicles has stopped moving. Not slow traffic, not construction delays. Complete stop, northbound and southbound. From the Williamson County line north of Austin, all the way to the Dallas suburbs. 206 miles of stopped vehicles, containing approximately 350,000 people who are about to learn that the worst place to be during a zombie outbreak is trapped in your car on a Texas highway in 105-degree heat with nowhere to go. My name is David Morgan, broadcasting on 96.7 FM, Kaz, out of Austin. I cover traffic and weather for Central Texas, which means I spend most of my time telling people that I-35 is backed up again, and that it's hot again, and that both of those things are just what August in Texas feels like. Right now, I'm telling you something different. Because 12 minutes ago, at 3:35 p.m., Texas Department of Public Safety issued a code I've been monitoring their frequencies for 8 years and never heard them use. Code Black. Highway threat requiring immediate closure of all lanes in both directions, with no estimated time for reopening. The threat started at the Flying J truck stop at exit 268, approximately 40 miles north of Austin. Before I tell you exactly what happened at that truck stop, I need you to do something if you're watching this later. Subscribe to Outbreak FM on YouTube right now. Not later. Now. Because what's happening on I-35 is going to spread, and this frequency is going to be the fastest source of verified information you'll have. Hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which mile marker you're at, or which Texas city you're calling from. Then listen to every word I'm about to say, because your survival might depend on it. At 3:35 p.m., a truck driver collapsed at a fuel pump. At the Flying J, other drivers tried to help. Within 6 minutes, 4 people were on the ground. Within 9 minutes, those 4 people were attacking others. Within 12 minutes, Texas DPS made the decision to close I-35 completely because the truck stop sits directly at the highway interchange, and they couldn't risk infected individuals reaching the mainline traffic. But when DPS closed the highway, there were already 190,000 vehicles on it. Those vehicles are now stationary. Those 350,000 people are now trapped between exit ramps that lead to small Texas towns with populations of 500 or 2,000 or 8,000. And those towns don't have the infrastructure to handle 350,000 highway refugees showing up simultaneously. At 3:49 p.m., the temperature on the asphalt is 112 degrees. Inside vehicles with engines running and AC on, it's manageable. Inside vehicles with engines off, because people are conserving fuel, it's approaching 100 degrees. Inside vehicles that have been running AC for an extended period and are now running out of fuel, it's becoming dangerous. And I haven't even told you yet about the transmission timeline. At 3:52 p.m., I'm getting reports from DPS radio traffic that the Flying J incident has spread to the vehicles nearest the exit. People got out of their cars to see what was causing the closure. People walked toward the truck stop because humans are curious, and because nobody had told them yet what they were walking toward. Some of those people are now walking back toward the highway showing symptoms. The progression timeline based on what DPS is reporting matches every other outbreak I've tracked. Bite to symptoms in 8 to 12 minutes. Symptoms to violent behavior in another 10 to 15 minutes. Total timeline from exposure to danger. Approximately 20 to 25 minutes in this heat. And heat matters because Texas in August accelerates every biological process. The infection moves faster. The infected degrade faster. But faster degradation still means 45 to 60 minutes of mobility. And in 45 minutes, an infected person can reach a lot of stationary vehicles. At 3:55 p.m., I need everyone on I-35 right now to understand your tactical situation. You are in a vehicle. That vehicle has locks and windows and metal between you and the outside. That makes it defensible. What makes it vulnerable is that you can't move it. And if you run out of fuel, you lose climate control. And if you lose climate control in 105-degree heat, you have a limited time window before heat exhaustion becomes a bigger threat than infection. So here's what you do. Lock your doors. Close your windows. Run your AC conservatively. Monitor your fuel gauge. And stay in your vehicle unless you have confirmed information that movement is safe. Do not get out to look. Do not walk toward the incident. Do not walk toward other vehicles. The people you see walking on the highway right now might be fine. They might be infected. You can't tell until they're close enough to be dangerous. At 3:58 p.m., the Austin Police Department has dispatched units to the southern end of the closure at the Travis County line. The Dallas Police Department has units moving toward the northern end at the Denton County line. The Texas National Guard has been activated and is mobilizing from Camp Mabry in Austin and Fort Hood near Killeen. But Fort Hood is 70 miles from the nearest point of the closure, and mobilization takes time, and time is measured in transmission cycles that compound every 25 minutes. At 4:01 p.m., I'm going to tell you about Texas highway infrastructure, because it matters for what happens next. Interstate 35 through Central Texas has rest stops every 30 to 40 miles. Each rest stop has facilities, parking, vending. Each rest stop currently has between 200 and 800 people who stop to use bathrooms or get food or rest before continuing their drive. Those rest stops are now isolated nodes with populations that are trapped the same way highway traffic is trapped, except rest stops have buildings, and those buildings can be secured if people make smart decisions fast. At 4:03 p.m., the Belton rest stop at mile marker 294 is reporting an incident. That's 54 miles from the Flying J. That's too far for infected to have walked from the origin point, which means either there's a second origin or infected individuals got into vehicles before symptoms manifested and drove north before transitioning. Either way, the outbreak is not contained to one location. It's distributed along the highway. At 4:06 p.m., Texas is big. That's not metaphor. That's geography that matters tonight. The distance from Austin to Dallas is 206 miles. The population in the corridor between those cities is approximately 3 million people living in towns and suburbs and cities along the highway. Round Rock, Temple, Waco, Hillsboro. Those communities are about to have 350,000 people from the highway trying to reach them for safety or supplies, or just because they're the nearest building. At 4:08 p.m., I'm tracking radio traffic from multiple Texas DPS regions, and what I'm hearing is organized chaos. Officers are responding to the Flying J. Officers are responding to Belton. Officers are establishing traffic control at exit ramps to prevent highway populations from flooding into towns. Officers are trying to coordinate with local police and sheriff's departments who are not equipped for this scale of incident. Texas DPS is professional and well-trained, but they're managing a 200-mile crisis zone with finite resources. At 4:11 p.m., the heat is not just discomfort. It's a tactical factor. Texas in August kills people through heat exposure every year. People working outside, people exercising, people stuck in cars that lose AC. Tonight, we're adding that baseline danger to the outbreak danger. If you're in a vehicle and you're running out of fuel, you have decisions to make. Do you stay in a vehicle that's becoming an oven? Or do you risk moving to a building? There's no universal right answer. The right answer depends on your specific location and fuel status and proximity to other people. At 4:13 p.m., I'm going to talk about what I'm seeing on traffic cameras, because Texas has extensive highway camera coverage and I have access to those feeds through sources. I'm not going to name, but who understand that public information matters during crisis. The cameras show I-35 as a parking lot. Vehicles stationary in all lanes. People visible outside some vehicles. Movement between vehicles in some areas. And in a few locations, movement that looks wrong. People walking in ways that don't look purposeful. That's what infection looks like from altitude. At 4:16 p.m., someone is going to ask why I'm on the air broadcasting this instead of waiting for official channels. The answer is that official channels are overwhelmed. DPS is managing tactical response. Local authorities are coordinating resources. Nobody has bandwidth to run continuous public information. That's what local radio does. I've been on this frequency for 8 years. I know Texas highways. I know this audience. And right now, you need information faster than official sources can provide it. So I'm providing it. At 4:18 p.m., the sunset tonight is at 7:52 p.m. That's 3 hours and 34 minutes of daylight remaining. When the sun goes down, visibility changes. Camera feeds lose effectiveness. DPS operations become more difficult. And 350,000 people are going to be sitting in the dark on a Texas highway with limited information about what's happening around them. We need to make significant progress before sunset. At 4:21 p.m., I'm receiving unofficial reports through sources monitoring emergency radio that the incident count along I-35 is now above 20 individual locations. Some are rest stops. Some are vehicles where people transition after getting back on the highway. Some are exit ramps where people walk toward towns. 20 incidents across 200 miles means this is not a single containment operation. This is corridor management requiring coordination across multiple counties and jurisdictions. At 4:23 p.m., Williamson County, which includes the northern Austin suburbs, has activated their Emergency Operations Center. Travis County, which includes Austin proper, has done the same. Bell County around Temple and Killeen. McLennan County around Waco. Every county the highway runs through is activating crisis protocols simultaneously. That's Texas responding the way Texas responds. Local authorities taking control while coordinating with state resources. At 4:26 p.m., I want everyone trapped on I-35 to hear this directly from me. You are not alone. 350,000 people are in the same situation you are. Help is being mobilized. The National Guard is coming. DPS is working the problem. Local authorities are establishing support. But help takes time to arrive and organize. And in that time, you need to maintain your position, conserve your resources, and make smart decisions about when to stay and when to move. At 4:28 p.m., the Texas heat is going to be your enemy and your weapon tonight. It's your enemy because it makes vehicles dangerous when a sea fails. It's your weapon because infected degrade faster in extreme heat. An infected individual who transitions at 4 p.m. is going to be significantly degraded by 5 p.m. and possibly immobile by 5:30 p.m. The heat that's making you uncomfortable is killing them. That's biology in Texas conditions. At 4:30 p.m., I'm staying on this frequency until this crisis resolves. I'm going to give you information as fast as I verify it. I'm going to coordinate with DPS and local authorities when they have bandwidth to talk to me. And I'm going to be the voice that tells you when it's safe to move and where it's safe to move to. Stay in your vehicles. Stay alert. Stay on this frequency. Because Texas is about to learn that the worst traffic jam in history is happening right now on I-35. At 4:33 p.m., Texas Department of Public Safety issues their first official public statement about the I-35 closure. The statement says Interstate 35 is closed in both directions from mile marker 247 in northern Austin to mile marker 453 in southern Dallas due to a public safety emergency. Motorists currently on the highway should remain in vehicles. Do not exit vehicles. Do not approach other motorists. Await further instruction from law enforcement. The statement doesn't say zombie outbreak, but DPS doesn't have terminology for zombie outbreak, so they're using the language they have. At 4:36 p.m., the statement triggers exactly the behavior it was trying to prevent. People who were sitting calmly in vehicles, wondering what's happening now know something serious is happening, and some of them decide that remaining in vehicles isn't the smart choice. Traffic camera feeds show increasing numbers of people exiting vehicles and walking. Some are walking toward exits. Some are walking between cars. Some are walking in directions that suggest they're not moving voluntarily anymore. At 4:38 p.m., the Round Rock Police Department, serving the northern Austin suburbs, reports they're establishing checkpoint operations at I-35 exit ramps within city limits. They're screening people coming off the highway. Temperature checks. Visual assessment. Anyone showing symptoms is being diverted to isolation assessment. Anyone clear is being directed to shelter locations. Round Rock has a population of 130,000 and is not equipped to absorb thousands of highway refugees, but they're doing it anyway because that's the situation. At 4:41 p.m., I need to tell you about Texas's geographic challenge tonight. I-35 runs through the middle of the state like an artery. On the east side, you have smaller highways like 77 and 79 and 287. The west side, you have 281 and 183 and State Highway 6. Those alternate routes are now receiving diverted traffic as people who are heading to Austin or Dallas or intermediate points try to route around the closure. Those alternate highways weren't designed for I-35's volume. They're going to become congested within the hour. At 4:43 p.m., the Temple Police Department is reporting that vehicles from I-35 are exiting at their city limits, and the volume is overwhelming their traffic infrastructure. Temple is a city of 80,000 people that's experiencing an influx of thousands of vehicles simultaneously. Every gas station is at capacity. Every fast food restaurant has lines to the street. Every hotel is booked. The highway refugees are arriving, and Temple is absorbing them while also trying to assess who might be infected. At 4:46 p.m., I'm tracking weather because weather matters in Texas, and it's going to matter more tonight. Current temperature 105 degrees. Forecast overnight low 82 degrees. That's a hot night even by Texas standards. No rain forecast. Clear skies. The heat that's been a factor all afternoon is going to continue being a factor all night. Infected who survive initial degradation are going to face overnight heat that's still above 80 degrees at the coolest point. At 4:48 p.m., the Texas National Guard's first elements are arriving at the Flying J truck stop where this started. Approximately 100 soldiers establishing perimeter security and beginning assessment of the situation. The Guard commander on scene is reporting to DPS that the truck stop is compromised with multiple infected and multiple civilian casualties, and that clearing operations are going to take significant time and resources. At 4:51 p.m., civilian casualties. That's military terminology for dead. I'm going to say that plainly, because plain language matters during crisis. People died at the Flying J truck stop. I don't have numbers yet. DPS isn't releasing numbers yet, but casualties is plural, which means more than one, which means families are going to receive notifications that someone who stopped for fuel this afternoon didn't make it home. At 4:53 p.m., the Waco Police Department, 97 miles north of Austin, is reporting that they're receiving calls from I-35 motorists trapped in their city limits. Waco is the largest city between Austin and Dallas, with a population of 140,000. The section of I-35 running through Waco contains approximately 30,000 stopped vehicles at current estimate. That's 60,000 people minimum in stopped traffic in Waco's section of highway. Waco PD is establishing security presence and trying to assess how many of those 60,000 people are infected versus trapped versus panicking. At 4:56 p.m., I'm going to address something that several people have texted to the station about, which is whether you should abandon your vehicle and walk to the nearest exit. The answer depends entirely on your specific situation. If you're within a quarter mile of an exit, and you have clear visibility, and you can see the exit, and you can see that the path is clear, walking might be viable. If you're in the middle lanes a mile from any exit with limited visibility of who's between you and safety, staying in your vehicle is smarter. There's no universal answer. Assess your specific circumstances. At 4:58 p.m., the sunset is now 2 hours and 54 minutes away. In 2 hours and 54 minutes, 350,000 people on I-35 are going to transition from daylight crisis to darkness crisis. Some of them have flashlights. Some have phone lights. Some have nothing but whatever ambient light reaches them from other vehicles and distant cities. Darkness doesn't make infected more dangerous, but it makes everything harder to see and harder to assess and harder to respond to. At 5 p.m., Texas is 3 time zones wide if you count the western tip near El Paso, but the I-35 corridor is all Central Time, which means everyone trapped on this highway is synchronized to the same clock. 5 p.m. on a Friday in August. Normally, people would be heading home from work, or heading to dinner, or heading to weekend plans. Instead, they're stationary in heat, trying to understand how a normal drive became a survival situation. At 5:03 p.m., the Texas Department of State Health Services is issuing guidance for anyone bitten or exposed. Immediate aggressive wound, decontamination with antiseptic if available. Isolation from others if symptoms develop. Contact emergency services for assessment. The guidance is professional and comprehensive, and almost completely useless for people trapped in vehicles on a highway with no access to antiseptic or medical supplies or emergency services that can reach them. At 5:05 p.m., I'm receiving reports through DPS radio that several rest stops along the corridor have self-organized into defensive positions. People inside the facilities have locked doors. People in the parking lots have returned to vehicles. Security is being maintained by whoever has the skills or the willingness to take charge. One rest stop near your rail has apparently been organized by a former Marine who was traveling through and who took control of the situation that needed controlling. These self-organized responses are survival happening in real time. At 5:08 p.m., the Cameron Park rest stop at mile marker 343 near Waco is reporting they've successfully isolated infected individuals in a maintenance facility and are maintaining perimeter security with approximately 200 people secured inside the main building. That's crisis management by civilians who made smart decisions fast. That rest stop is going to have 0 casualties if they maintain their protocols until official help arrives. At 5:11 p.m., I need to tell you what the Texas National Guard deployment looks like at 5:11 p.m. First elements at the Flying J origin point. Additional units moving toward Belton, where the second major incident occurred. More units staged in Austin, Temple, Waco, and Hillsborough, preparing to deploy to hot spots as they're identified. Total Guard presence in the corridor estimated at 800 soldiers, with more being mobilized. That's significant military presence, but it's distributed across 200 miles, which means coverage is thin. At 5:13 p.m., the heat inside vehicles is becoming the secondary crisis. DPS is receiving calls about heat exhaustion, people with medical conditions being exacerbated by temperature, children and elderly being affected faster than healthy adults. The highway situation is not just infection management anymore. It's also a heat emergency affecting 350,000 people who are trapped in the sun in metal boxes. At 5:16 p.m., Travis County Emergency Services is establishing cooling centers in Austin for highway refugees. Air-conditioned buildings, water, medical assessment. They're directing people who can reach Austin exits to shelter locations. Austin has infrastructure to handle this because Austin is a major city. The smaller towns along the corridor don't have the same capacity. At 5:18 p.m., I'm tracking social media because social media during crisis is where real-time ground truth lives. People trapped on I-35 are posting videos, posting updates, asking for help, sharing information. The posts are creating a crowdsourced map of conditions along the highway. Some sections are calm. Some sections show infected presence. Some sections show panic. The map is incomplete and sometimes inaccurate, but it's information that's flowing faster than official channels can provide. At 5:21 p.m., the Georgetown Police Department north of Austin reports they're managing approximately 15,000 vehicles that have exited I-35 into their city. Georgetown has a population of 75,000. They just absorbed 20% more people in 1 hour. The city's infrastructure is stressed but functioning. Gas stations are rationing fuel. Restaurants are managing crowds. Hotels are coordinating with emergency services to provide overflow shelter. At 5:23 p.m., Texas is handling this the way Texas handles everything, with local initiative and state coordination, and a lot of individual people making practical decisions without waiting for permission. The cities are opening cooling centers. The police are managing crowds. The citizens are self-organizing. The National Guard is deploying. Nobody's waiting for a perfect plan. Everyone's executing the plan they can execute with the resources they have. At 5:26 p.m., the infection count along I-35 is still unknown, but DPS is estimating, based on reported incidents that they're tracking, between 60 and 100 infected individuals distributed across the 200-mile corridor. Some have been neutralized. Some are in late-stage degradation. Some are still mobile. The count is going to increase as people who were exposed in the first hour reach transition, and it's going to decrease as the heat degrades the infected faster than they can spread. At 5:28 p.m., the timeline is working in our favor. The first infected from the Flying J incident at 3:35 p.m. are now approaching 2 hours post-transition. In Texas heat, 2 hours is approaching complete degradation for most infected. The danger window is closing for the first wave. The question is, how many subsequent waves were created before containment limited transmission? Stay on I-35 if you're trapped there. Stay in your vehicles if it's safe to do so. Stay informed. We're 2 hours and 24 minutes from sunset, and Texas is managing. At 5:31 p.m., the Texas governor issues an emergency declaration for 14 counties along the I-35 corridor from Travis County in the south to Denton County in the north. The declaration activates additional National Guard units, authorizes emergency funding, and gives local authorities enhanced powers to manage the crisis. It's the formal governmental response, catching up to what's been happening on the ground for 2 hours. At 5:34 p.m., I'm going to tell you about what successful containment looks like in Texas conditions, because we're starting to see it happen. The Temple rest stop at mile marker 305 has 240 people secured inside and 0 infected breaches in 90 minutes since they locked down. They did it by making fast decisions. Lock the doors, consolidate people inside, establish watch, ration resources. They're going to maintain that position until Guard units clear the area. That's survival through organization. At 5:37 p.m., the contrast between organized rest stops and disorganized highway sections is stark. Rest stops that lock down early are secure. Highway sections where people exited vehicles and created movement are showing infected presence and transmission. The difference is containment discipline, the ability to stay in a defensive position even when instinct says move. At 5:39 p.m., the Belton incident that started at 4:03 p.m. is now being cleared by National Guard units who arrived at 5:15 p.m. The Guard is reporting approximately 12 infected individuals at various stages of degradation, multiple civilian casualties, and a compromised rest stop facility that's going to require extensive clearing before it can be used again. Belton is hour 2 of the outbreak, and the Guard is systematically addressing it with the resources now available. At 5:42 p.m., the heat is now working as our primary weapon. Current temperature 103 degrees. Asphalt temperature 110 degrees. Inside vehicles running AC, manageable. Outside vehicles, deadly for both humans and infected. The infected who are still mobile are moving slower. The infected who transitioned early are approaching immobility. Every minute the temperature stays high is a minute that degrades infected faster than they can spread. At 5:44 p.m., I need to address fuel conservation because it's becoming critical for vehicles that have been running AC continuously for 2 hours. If you're below a quarter tank, you need to make decisions. Running AC until empty leaves you with no options. Shutting off AC and managing heat manually preserves fuel but creates heat risk. The calculus is, how long until help arrives versus how long your fuel lasts? There's no perfect answer, but there are wrong answers, and running completely out of fuel is a wrong answer. At 5:47 p.m., the Dallas Police Department is establishing presence at the northern end of the closure in Denton County. Dallas has a population of 1.3 million and infrastructure to support massive crowds. They're preparing to receive highway refugees from the northern section of I-35, the same way Austin is receiving refugees from the southern section. The two major cities are acting as bookends, absorbing the highway population and providing security and resources. At 5:49 p.m., Texas DPS is updating their incident count. Confirmed incidents, 47 separate locations along the 200-mile corridor. That's approximately one incident every 4 miles. Some incidents are single infected individuals. Some are clusters. Some are rest stops with multiple exposures. The distribution suggests the outbreak spread through people exiting the highway at multiple points rather than through a single expanding wave. At 5:52 p.m., the Texas Department of State Health Services is confirming that the pathogen matches the prion-based strain identified in other outbreaks. Same transmission mechanism through bites. Same progression timeline of 20 to 30 minutes from exposure to violent behavior. Same degradation timeline of 60 to 90 minutes from transition to immobility in hot conditions. Texas isn't facing something new. Texas is facing something documented, which means we know how it behaves and how to respond. At 5:55 p.m., the sunset is 1 hour and 57 minutes away. The light is starting to change from harsh afternoon to softer early evening. In Texas in August, this is usually when the day becomes tolerable, when you can sit outside without feeling like the sun is actively hostile. Tonight is just a timer counting down to darkness and changed visibility conditions. At 5:57 p.m., I'm receiving reports that several highway sections are seeing organized civilian response. People with medical training providing care. People with law enforcement or military backgrounds organizing perimeter security. People with food or water sharing resources. The 350,000 people trapped on I-35 aren't passive victims. They're Texans who are used to self-reliance and who are applying that to unprecedented circumstances. At 6 p.m., we're 2 hours and 25 minutes into the closure. The National Guard has approximately 1,000 soldiers deployed or deploying along the corridor. Texas DPS has committed every available trooper. Local police departments are managing their sections. The response is coordinated and professional, and it's working incrementally. Not solved, not secure, but working. At 6:03 p.m., the Georgetown Cooling Center reports they've received approximately 2,000 people from I-35. Medical staff has assessed everyone. 3 individuals were showing symptoms and were isolated. The remaining people are being sheltered in air-conditioned facilities, while transportation options are coordinated. Georgetown is doing exactly what organized disaster response looks like. At 6:05 p.m., I want to talk about the communities along I-35 that are smaller than Georgetown or Temple or Round Rock. Places like Yarrail with a population of 1,200. Salatho with 2,400, West with 2,800. These small towns are experiencing highway refugee populations that exceed their own populations. A town of 1,200 receiving 3,000 vehicles means the town is absorbing more than twice its own population in crisis conditions. And they're doing it because that's what you do when people need help and you're the nearest help available. At 6:08 p.m., the Arail rest stop that I mentioned earlier as being organized by a former Marine has now established contact with DPS and is coordinating with approaching guard units. The Marine's name is Robert Hayes. He organized 216 people into a defensive perimeter, established resource rationing, and maintained 0 infected breaches for 95 minutes. Robert Hayes is going to be a case study in civilian crisis leadership. At 6:11 p.m., the Texas heat is beginning its slow decline toward the overnight low. Current temperature 100 degrees, dropping approximately 2 degrees every 30 minutes until we reach the overnight low of 82 around 2 a.m. That's still hot. That's still dangerous for heat exposure. But it's cooler than peak afternoon, and it's going to continue getting cooler. And every degree down is a degree that makes vehicle occupancy more survivable. At 6:13 p.m., I'm tracking the infection progression timeline against the degradation timeline, and the numbers are starting to favor containment. The first infected at 3:35 p.m. are now 2 hours and 38 minutes post-transition. In Texas heat, that puts them at late-stage degradation approaching complete immobility. The second wave that started around 4 p.m. is now 2 hours post-transition, also approaching late degradation. The window of peak mobility for infected is 45 to 60 minutes in these conditions. We're past that window for the early waves. At 6:16 p.m., the Waco section of I-35 is being cleared in coordinated operations between Waco PD, McLennan County Sheriff, and National Guard units. They're going vehicle by vehicle in the affected sections, assessing occupants, clearing threats, and establishing safe corridors for people to exit to shelter locations. It's methodical, it's slow, it's working. At 6:18 p.m., Texas DPS updates their casualty information. Confirmed deceased, 27. That's 27 people who stopped at truck stops or rest areas, or who were in the wrong section of highway when infected. Individuals were mobile. 27 families receiving notifications. 27 losses that Texas is going to carry. The number is preliminary and will likely increase as clearing operations continue, but it's the first official count. At 6:21 p.m., I need everyone still trapped on I-35 to hear this directly. You have survived 2 hours and 46 minutes of this crisis. You've made decisions that kept you alive. The help that was being mobilized when this started is now deployed and working toward you. The Guard is clearing sections systematically. DPS is maintaining security. Local authorities are providing shelter. The worst is approaching over. Not over, approaching over. At 6:23 p.m., the Round Rock checkpoint operations have processed approximately 8,000 people off I-35 in the southern section. Of those 8,000, 43 were showing symptoms and were diverted to medical isolation. That's approximately 0.5% symptomatic, which means 99.5% of people coming off the highway are uninfected and just need shelter and resources and information about what happens next. At 6:26 p.m., the sun is now 1 hour and 26 minutes from setting. The light is going gold the way it does in Texas, that particular quality where everything looks cinematic for about 90 minutes before dark. Usually it's beautiful. Tonight, it's just the last hour of clear visibility before operations become more difficult. At 6:28 p.m., I'm staying on this frequency until morning. I'm going to broadcast through sunset and through the night and through sunrise tomorrow, because people need information continuously, not just during daylight hours, and this is what local radio does. We stay on when staying on matters. Texas is holding I-35. The corridor is being secured. And 350,000 people are learning that the worst traffic jam in state history is also survivable. At 6:31 p.m., the National Guard establishes forward operating bases at 3 locations along the corridor: Austin at Camp Mabry, Temple at the Municipal Airport, and Waco at the Texas State Technical College. These bases give the Guard staging points for operations and create regional command structures that can coordinate clearing operations more efficiently than trying to manage 200 miles from a single location. At 6:34 p.m., the Temple Forward Operating Base Commander, Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, provides an operational update through DPS coordination. The Guard has now deployed approximately 1,500 soldiers along the corridor with another 1,000 in mobilization. They're dividing the corridor into sectors: South Sector Austin to Round Rock, Central Sector Round Rock to Temple, North Sector Temple to Hillsboro, and Dallas Sector Hillsboro to Dallas suburbs. Each sector has assigned Guard units, DPS coordination, and local law enforcement integration. At 6:37 p.m., I'm receiving reports that the I-35 closure is creating secondary effects on Texas's entire highway network. US 290 west of Austin is backed up with diverted traffic. Highway 77 east of the corridor is experiencing unusual volume. State Highway 6 through Central Texas is congested. The closure of I-35 is cascading through the system the way a blocked artery affects entire circulation. Texas DPS is managing traffic flow statewide now, not just in the corridor. At 6:39 p.m., the heat inside stopped vehicles is now the primary non-infection emergency. Texas Emergency Medical Services is responding to heat exhaustion calls along the entire corridor. Children, elderly, and people with pre-existing conditions are being affected first. Some vehicles have run out of fuel and lost to sea entirely. Some people are making the decision to exit vehicles and walk to shade or shelter despite the risks. Heat is forcing movement that containment protocols would prefer to prevent. At 6:42 p.m., the Austin cooling centers are now at capacity, with approximately 12,000 people sheltered across multiple locations. The city is opening additional facilities and coordinating with churches, schools, and community centers to provide overflow capacity. Austin has experience managing large crowds from events like South by Southwest and Formula 1. They're applying that event management expertise to crisis management, and it's translating effectively. At 6:45 p.m., I need to tell you what the clearing operations actually look like on the ground, because systematic clearing is not fast or dramatic. It's Guard units or DPS troopers approaching vehicle sections in coordinated teams, checking each vehicle, assessing occupants, clearing threats, directing people to safe exit routes, moving to the next vehicle. Repeat for thousands of vehicles across miles of highway. It's methodical and professional, and it takes time because doing it fast creates casualties. At 6:47 p.m., a Salado section of highway near mile marker 283 has been cleared and verified safe. Approximately 3,000 vehicles in that section are being given clearance to proceed south toward Austin shelters or north toward Temple shelters. That's the first major section of highway transitioning from stop to moving, not normal traffic. Escorted convoy movement at reduced speed, but movement nonetheless. At 6:50 p.m., the sunset is 1 hour and 2 minutes away. The temperature is 97 degrees and continuing to drop. The overnight forecast still shows a low of 82, which in normal circumstances would be an uncomfortable night. Tonight, it's going to feel like relief compared to the afternoon highs. At 6:52 p.m., Texas DPS is updating their infection count based on clearing operations data. Total infected identified along the corridor, estimated between 80 and 100 individuals. Of those, approximately 60 have been neutralized through Guard or law enforcement action. Approximately 20 are in late-stage degradation approaching immobility. The remaining potentially mobile infected are being actively tracked and contained. The numbers are working in favor of containment. At 6:55 p.m., I'm going to address something that people are asking through texts and calls to the station. When does I-35 reopen fully? The answer is not tonight. DPS is estimating that full clearing operations and safety verification will take until tomorrow afternoon at earliest. The highway will reopen in sections as they're cleared, but complete reopening requires assessing 200 miles of roadway, removing abandoned vehicles, clearing all rest stops, and verifying safety. That's not a midnight operation. That's a daylight tomorrow operation. At 6:58 p.m., the Cameron Park rest stop that organized early and maintained security is being cleared by guard units who are reporting 0 breaches and 0 casualties among the 200 people secured inside. That rest stop is the success story of today. 200 people who made smart decisions collectively and maintained those decisions for 3 hours and are now being safely extracted with everyone intact. That's what organized civilian response produces. At 7 p.m., we're 3 hours and 25 minutes into the closure. The crisis is definitively in resolution phase. Not resolved, not safe to ignore. But the emergency peak has passed, and what remains is systematic management and careful clearing and eventually return to normal operations. At 7:03 p.m., the Waco section clearing operations are approximately 60% complete. Waco PD estimates they've cleared 15,000 vehicles in their jurisdiction and have another 10,000 to process. The pace is limited by the need to check every vehicle and assess every occupant and clear every potential threat. Fast clearing creates mistakes. Methodical clearing creates safety. At 7:05 p.m., I want to talk about what happens tomorrow for the 350,000 people affected by tonight. Some of them will drive home tonight once their section is cleared. Some will shelter in place overnight and resume travel tomorrow. Some will need extended support because their vehicles are out of fuel or damaged or unsafe to drive. Texas is preparing for multi-day support operations for potentially tens of thousands of people who can't immediately return to normal. At 7:08 p.m., the Texas Division of Emergency Management is establishing family reunification protocols. People separated from family members during the closure can register at reunification centers being set up in Austin, Temple, Waco, and Dallas. The centers are coordinating with DPS and Guard to track cleared individuals and connect families who lost contact during the crisis. At 7:11 p.m., the small towns along I-35 are being supported by state resources. Yarrell, Salotho, West, Hillsborough. These communities absorbed populations larger than their own and provided shelter and resources without hesitation. The state is reimbursing emergency expenses and providing ongoing support for communities that stepped up during crisis. At 7:13 p.m., the Georgetown police chief is providing media updates about their response. His statement emphasizes that Georgetown received 15,000 refugees, processed them professionally, identified and isolated symptomatic individuals, and maintained order throughout. He's explicitly thanking his officers and the community volunteers who made it work. That's leadership acknowledging the people who did the actual work. At 7:16 p.m., I'm tracking social media trends, and the Texas outbreak is global news. Videos from I-35, first-hand accounts, news helicopter footage. The images are spreading worldwide, and Texas is now representing the face of zombie outbreak response for international audiences. How Texas handles tonight is being watched and will be studied and will influence how other places prepare. At 7:18 p.m., the Dallas sector at the northern end of the closure is beginning clearing operations with heavy DPS and Dallas PD presence. The northern end has been less affected than the central corridor because it's farther from the Flying J origin point. Most infected never reach that far north. The Dallas section is more about managing stopped traffic than active outbreak, which means faster clearing times. At 7:21 p.m., the heat has dropped to 94 degrees. Still hot, still draining, still dangerous for extended exposure without hydration, but cooler than peak and dropping steadily. The overnight cool down is beginning, and it's going to make vehicle occupancy survivable for people who've been managing heat stress for hours. At 7:23 p.m., Colonel Rodriguez from the Temple Forward Operating Base confirms that Guard units have now cleared all major rest stops in the central sector. Every rest stop from Austin to Temple has been systematically cleared, infected neutralized or contained, civilians evacuated to shelter, and facilities secured. That's comprehensive clearing of critical infrastructure completed in under 4 hours from Guard activation. At 7:26 p.m., the sunset is 26 minutes away. The sky is going orange and pink, the way Texas skies do when the atmosphere is clear and the sun is low. It's the kind of sunset that photographers chase, and that normally would have people pulling over to take pictures. Tonight, 350,000 people are watching it from stationary vehicles and processing that they survived to see it. At 7:28 p.m., I'm going to tell you what tomorrow looks like. Saturday morning, August, Texas. The highway will be in active clearing operations. Sections will reopen progressively. Cooling centers will continue operations. Shelters will provide breakfast and assessment. News crews will be interviewing survivors. Investigators will be examining the Flying J to understand how this started. And Texas will begin processing collectively what happened when its main highway became impassable for 7 hours. Stay on I-35 if you're there. Help is reaching you section by section. Texas is managing this professionally, and we're 26 minutes from sunset. At 7:31 p.m., the National Guard provides comprehensive casualty accounting based on completed clearing operations in the southern and central sectors. Confirmed deceased, 34. Injured requiring hospitalization, 67. Infected neutralized, 73. Currently in medical isolation, showing symptoms, 18. The numbers are preliminary, but more accurate than earlier estimates, because they're based on systematic clearing data rather than incident reports. At 7:34 p.m., 34 deceased means 34 people who were on I-35 this afternoon and aren't going home tonight. The number is devastating in human terms and manageable in crisis response terms. 350,000 people exposed to outbreak conditions for 7 hours with 34 fatalities represents effective containment and professional response. Both things can be true. The losses are real, and the response prevented the losses from being exponentially worse. At 7:37 p.m., the sun sets at 7:52 p.m. 15 minutes of daylight remaining. The Guard is transitioning to night operations with full tactical lighting. DPS is deploying additional resources with night vision capability. The clearing operations are going to continue through darkness because stopping operations means leaving people trapped overnight unnecessarily when clearing is possible with proper equipment. At 7:39 p.m., I'm receiving updates about the Flying J truck stop where this started. Guard units have completed full clearing. The facility is secured. The civilian casualties have been identified and families are being notified. The truck driver who collapsed at the fuel pump at 3:35 p.m. has been identified as the likely index case. Investigators are working to determine where he contracted the infection before arriving at the Flying J. That investigation is going to take days or weeks and is going to examine his route and stops and contacts. At 7:42 p.m., the Round Rock checkpoints have now processed over 20,000 people off I-35 in the southern sector. The processing rate has improved as procedures became standardized and as additional screening personnel were deployed. People are moving through assessment in approximately 10 to 15 minutes and being cleared to shelter or diverted to medical evaluation. Round Rock is running processing operations at scale. At 7:45 p.m., the Temple shelters are reporting they're housing approximately 8,000 people across multiple facilities. Every church in Temple with a large fellowship hall has opened. Every school with a gymnasium has been activated. the community college is providing dormitory space. Temple is a city of 80,000 that's temporarily housing 10% more population and providing food, water, medical care, and coordination. At 7:47 p.m., the temperature is 92 degrees. The overnight cooldown is progressing on schedule. By midnight, we'll be at 86 degrees. By 2 a.m., we'll hit the overnight low of 82. By sunrise tomorrow, at 6:43 a.m., we'll be back to 84 and beginning the climb toward another hot Texas day. Tonight's relatively cooler temperatures are giving everyone trapped in vehicles relief from the peak afternoon heat. At 7:50 p.m., I need to talk about fuel because it's now critical for thousands of vehicles. People who started this afternoon with half a tank have been running a C for 7 hours. Basic math says they're approaching empty. DPS and guard units are coordinating fuel delivery to highway sections where vehicles are stranded. Tank trucks are being escorted onto I-35 to provide emergency refueling. It's not comprehensive coverage, but it's targeted support for the vehicles that need it most urgently. At 7:52 p.m., the sun sets over central Texas. The last light is going pink and purple over the western horizon. Darkness settles over I-35 and over 350,000 people who are now managing crisis in the dark. Vehicle headlights create isolated pools of light. Guard tactical lighting illuminates clearing operation zones. The highway transforms from a sun-baked parking lot to a darkened corridor with scattered illumination. At 7:55 p.m., the darkness changes everything about visibility and assessment and movement. What you could see clearly at noon, you can't see at 8 p.m. DPS is advising everyone in vehicles to keep headlights on for visibility and safety. The highway needs to stay illuminated. Darkness creates hiding places for threats, and darkness creates uncertainty about what's moving between vehicles. At 7:58 p.m., the Waco clearing operations are now 75% complete. Waco PD estimates they'll have their entire jurisdiction cleared by 10 p.m. That's comprehensive clearing of 30,000 vehicles in 6 hours. Professional, methodical, safe. Waco is demonstrating what organized urban police response looks like at scale. At 8 p.m., we're 4 hours and 25 minutes into the closure. The crisis peak is definitively past. The emergency phase is over. What remains is systematic clearing and support operations and investigation and recovery. Texas has transitioned from reaction to management. At 8:03 p.m., I'm receiving reports that several sections of I-35 are being reopened to controlled traffic. The Salotho section that cleared at 6:47 p.m. is now allowing vehicles to proceed under escort. The Georgetown section is being prepared for reopening. The highway is returning to operational status section by section as clearing is verified complete. Not normal operations. Escorted convoy operations at reduced speed, but operations. At 8:05 p.m., the Texas governor is providing a televised address about the crisis. He's acknowledging the response by DPS, National Guard, local authorities, and civilians. He's expressing condolences for the 34 deceased. He's committing state resources to support affected communities. He's promising investigation into how the outbreak started and how to prevent future occurrences. It's the political response catching up to the operational response that's been happening on the ground. At 8:08 p.m., the Dallas sector clearing has been expedited because the northern end had minimal infected presence. Dallas PD is reporting their jurisdiction will be fully clear by 9 p.m. The northern bookend is opening faster than the central corridor, which means people trapped in the Dallas suburbs are going to be able to move before people trapped near Temple or Waco. At 8:11 p.m., I want to address what happens to I-35 long-term after tonight. The highway is going to reopen fully. Traffic is going to resume. The Flying J truck stop is going to be investigated and probably closed for extended renovation. Rest stops where incidents occurred are going to be assessed and upgraded. Security protocols at highway facilities are going to change. But I-35 itself, the road, is going to continue being what it's always been. Texas's main north-south artery, carrying 200,000 vehicles a day through the heart of the state. At 8:13 p.m., the infection progression timeline has now run its full course. The first infected at 3:35 p.m. are 4 hours and 38 minutes post-transition. In Texas heat, that's complete immobility and advanced degradation. Even infected who transitioned in the second or third wave are now past peak mobility. The biological window where infected are dangerous has closed. What remains mobile are isolated late-stage cases that GARD and DPS can address systematically. At 8:16 p.m., Texas Department of State Health Services is issuing guidance for people who are exposed but cleared medical screening. Monitor for symptoms for 72 hours. Fever, confusion, aggression. Report to medical facilities immediately if symptoms develop. The guidance is comprehensive, and it's also acknowledging that some exposed individuals might have slow-developing infections that weren't detected during rapid screening. That's medical caution operating on the side of safety. At 8:18 p.m., the Austin shelters are transitioning from emergency operations to overnight support. People are being provided food and sleeping accommodations. Families are being kept together. Medical staff is available. The emergency phase support is becoming overnight hospitality. Austin is treating 12,000 highway refugees like overnight guests who need care and support until they can resume travel. At 8:21 p.m., I'm going to stay on this frequency through the night. I'll broadcast updates as clearing progresses. I'll provide information about shelter locations and family reunification. I'll coordinate with DPS and GARD on operational status. This is what local radio does during extended crisis. We don't go off air when normal programming would resume, because normal programming isn't what tonight needs. At 8:23 p.m., the temperature is 89 degrees and dropping steadily. The heat stress that was dangerous at peak afternoon is becoming manageable. People can breathe easier. Vehicles are less oppressive. The Texas heat that was weapon and enemy simultaneously is becoming just uncomfortable rather than dangerous. At 8:26 p.m., Colonel Rodriguez provides an evening operational summary. The GARD has cleared approximately 80% of high-priority areas. All major rest stops secured. All known infected locations addressed. Remaining operations are systematic, vehicle-by-vehicle clearing in sections that didn't have active incidents but require verification before reopening. The operational tempo is decreasing as the emergency decreases. At 8:28 p.m., I'm looking at traffic camera feeds and seeing I-35 transforming in real time. Sections that were solid parking lots of stationary vehicles are now showing movement. Sections that were dark are now illuminated by GARD tactical lighting. Sections that were isolated are now connected to escort operations. The highway is coming back to life incrementally. Stay on I-35. Help has reached most sections. Clearing operations are nearly complete, and Texas is managing its worst highway crisis in history with professional response that's preventing catastrophic outcomes. At 8:31 p.m., DPS announces that I-35 is being reopened to escorted traffic in the southern sector from Austin to Round Rock. Vehicles that have been stationary for 5 hours can now proceed at reduced speed under DPS escort to Austin shelters, or to continue south if they're cleared through checkpoint screening. The southern section is officially transitioning from closed to controlled operations. At 8:34 p.m., the reopening creates immediate movement on highway sections that have been parking lots since 3:47 p.m. People start engines that have been off to conserve fuel. Vehicles that were dark come alive with headlights and taillights. The highway infrastructure that's been frozen resumes functioning. Not normal flow, heavily controlled convoy movement, but functioning nonetheless. At 8:37 p.m., I'm receiving texts from people on I-35 who are finally moving. The relief in those messages is obvious. People who've been trapped for 5 hours describing what it feels like to put a vehicle in drive and actually move forward. Some messages are just, "we're moving," repeated multiple times. Some are longer descriptions of emotions. All of them convey the same thing. Movement equals progress equals hope. At 8:39 p.m., the Temple section is preparing for reopening. Waco PD reports they'll be ready to release controlled traffic by 9 p.m. The central corridor that experienced the heaviest infected presence is being cleared fast enough that reopening is happening tonight rather than tomorrow. That's guard and DPS efficiency exceeding initial timeline estimates. At 8:42 p.m., Texas DPS updates the casualty count one more time based on complete clearing data from the southern and central sectors. Final count: 36 deceased, 71 injured requiring hospitalization, 78 infected neutralized during operations, 14 currently in medical isolation. The numbers have increased slightly as clearing operations found individuals who weren't visible from initial assessment, but they remain within the range that indicates effective containment. At 8:45 p.m., the overnight temperature is approaching the low 80s. The heat that defined the afternoon is now just background warmth. Texas nights in August are still warm, but they're survivable. And tonight, that survivability is going to make vehicle occupancy through the night possible for anyone who doesn't reach shelter before midnight. At 8:47 p.m., I want to talk about what investigation is going to look like tomorrow and in the coming days. The CDC is sending teams from Atlanta. The Texas Department of State Health Services is coordinating state-level investigation. DPS is handling criminal investigation aspects. Multiple federal agencies are going to be involved because interstate highway incidents trigger federal jurisdiction. The Flying J truck stop is going to be examined in forensic detail to understand transmission patterns and identify any systemic failures that allowed the outbreak to develop. At 8:50 p.m., the Index case, the truck driver who collapsed at 3:35 p.m., is being traced through shipping manifests in GPS logs and truck stop surveillance. Investigators need to know where he was in the 72 hours before collapse, where he stopped, who he contacted, what route he drove. That's epidemiological tracking on a continental scale, because long-haul truckers can cover 3,000 miles in 72 hours. At 8:52 p.m., the Georgetown section of I-35 is officially reopened to normal traffic. Not escort required. Not reduced speed beyond normal construction zone protocols. Full normal operations. Georgetown is the first section to achieve complete return to standard operations. That's comprehensive clearing and safety verification completed in 5 hours and 5 minutes from crisis start. At 8:55 p.m., the small towns along I-35 are beginning their own recovery operations. Yarrail, Salotho, West, Hillsboro. These communities absorbed thousands of refugees, provided shelter and support, maintained security, and are now transitioning to normal operations while continuing to host overnight guests who can't immediately continue travel. The support they provided is going to be studied as examples of small community crisis response. At 8:58 p.m., I'm tracking news coverage and seeing Texas response being characterized as professional and effective by national and international media. The containment worked. The Guard deployed fast. DPS coordinated well. Local authorities managed their jurisdictions professionally. Civilian response was organized. The narrative is forming. Texas handled a highway outbreak through effective multi-agency coordination and strong local response. That narrative is accurate. At 9 p.m., we're 5 hours and 25 minutes into the closure. Most of I-35 is now either cleared or in final clearing operations. The crisis that paralyzed 200 miles of highway is being resolved through systematic professional response. That's preventing the outcome from being catastrophic. At 9:03 p.m., the Waco section releases controlled traffic to move north or south under escort. 30,000 vehicles that have been stationary for 5 hours and 16 minutes can now proceed. Waco PD is coordinating with DPS and Guard to manage the flow and ensure safety. The central corridor is reopening section by section. At 9:05 p.m., I need to acknowledge something about tonight that's going to be discussed extensively in the coming days. Interstate 35 in Texas carries more traffic than most highways in America. It connects Mexico to Canada through the central United States, its economically critical infrastructure. Closing it completely for 5.5 hours creates economic impact measured in hundreds of millions of dollars in delayed shipping, missed deliveries, and disrupted commerce. The economic impact is real and significant, and also completely secondary to the human impact of preventing exponential outbreak spread. At 9:08 p.m., the Dallas sector is fully cleared and reopened to normal operations. The northern end of the closure is now functioning at standard capacity. The 200-mile closure has effectively shrunk to the remaining central sections still in final clearing operations. The corridor is returning to normal progressively. At 9:11 p.m., Texas DPS announces that complete reopening of all I-35 sections is projected for midnight. 3 hours from now, the highway that's been closed since 3:47 p.m. will be fully operational again. That's 8 hours and 13 minutes from closure to complete reopening. For a 200-mile corridor experiencing active outbreak conditions, that's remarkably fast restoration. At 9:13 p.m., I want to talk about what tonight means for highway infrastructure security nationally. I-35 is not unique. Every major interstate carries similar traffic volume. Every major highway has rest stops and truck stops and service plazas. What happened in Texas tonight could happen on I-95 or I-10 or I-5 or any major route. The question is whether other states have response protocols and coordination capability and National Guard integration that Texas demonstrated tonight. That's going to drive policy discussion at state and federal levels. At 9:16 p.m., the temperature is 85 degrees. The overnight low is projected for 2 a.m. at 82 degrees. Texas heat is finally breaking after a day where peak temperatures reached 105. The cool down is making everything more manageable for everyone still dealing with aftermath. At 9:18 p.m., the Austin shelters are providing overnight accommodations for approximately 9,000 people who chose not to resume travel tonight. Some vehicles ran out of fuel. Some people are too exhausted to drive safely. Some families with children decided overnight shelter was safer than night driving after traumatic afternoon. Austin is providing hospitality through the night and transportation coordination for tomorrow. At 9:21 p.m., Colonel Rodriguez provides the final Guard operational assessment for tonight. All high-priority clearing complete. All rest stops secured and reopened. All infected individuals neutralized or contained. Remaining Guard presence transitioning to security support and traffic management. Operational tempo decreasing. The military response is winding down as the emergency resolves. At 9:23 p.m., I'm receiving messages from people who made it home. People who were trapped for 5 hours and are now in their driveways or walking into their houses or hugging family members who were worried. The messages are expressing relief and gratitude and processing what they went through. Some are thanking me for staying on air. I'm telling them that staying on air was the easy part. They did the hard part by staying calm and making smart decisions while trapped. At 9:26 p.m., the Texas Department of Transportation is assessing I-35 infrastructure damage from the closure, abandoned vehicles that need removal, debris from incidents, pavement damage from stationary heavy vehicles. They're projecting normal operations can resume by morning, but that some sections might require maintenance work in coming days. The highway itself survived tonight, functionally intact. At 9:28 p.m., I'm going to stay on this frequency until midnight when the highway fully reopens. I'll provide updates on clearing operations and traffic flow. I'll coordinate information about shelters and resources. And I'll be here if anyone needs to hear a voice that's been here since this started. Texas handled tonight. I-35 is reopening. And 350,000 people survived the worst highway crisis in state history through professional response and personal resilience. At 9:31 p.m., the Temple section completes final clearing operations and reopens to normal traffic. The central corridor that experienced the heaviest outbreak activity is now fully functional again. Temple Police Chief provides media statement acknowledging his officers, the guard units who supported clearing, and the community members who provided shelter and support. He's explicitly stating that Temple handled an unprecedented crisis professionally. At 9:34 p.m., I'm looking at traffic flow data and seeing I-35 returning to normal volume patterns. Vehicles moving at highway speed. Traffic flowing smoothly through previously closed sections. The highway infrastructure that was paralyzed for 5.5 hours is functioning again. Not perfectly. Not without residual congestion from the backlog, but functioning at capacity. At 9:37 p.m., the final casualty accounting is being released by Texas Department of State Health Services. Total deceased, 36. Total injured requiring hospitalization, 71. Total infected neutralized, 78. Total currently in medical isolation, 12, down from earlier counts, as some cleared symptom monitoring. The numbers are final pending complete identification of all deceased individuals. At 9:39 p.m., 36 people died on I-35 today. 36 people who were traveling through Texas and who encountered an outbreak at a truck stop and who didn't make it home. Their names are being released as families are notified. Their losses are going to be felt by families and communities across multiple states because I-35 traffic comes from everywhere. Those 36 represent the human cost of today. At 9:42 p.m., I need to talk about the Flying J truck stop specifically because it's where this started and it's going to be central to investigation. The truck stop is a major facility and a major interchange. Hundreds of vehicles stop there daily. Thousands of people pass through weekly. It's critical infrastructure for highway commerce. Understanding how the outbreak started there and how it spread so rapidly is going to require detailed forensic investigation of the facility, the index case driver, and the timeline of transmission. At 9:45 p.m., the CDC teams arriving tomorrow are going to examine the truck stop for environmental factors, ventilation, layout, high-touch surfaces, crowd density at time of incident. They're going to reconstruct the transmission pattern person by person. They're going to identify every individual who was at the facility during the critical window. That's epidemiological investigation at scale. At 9:47 p.m., the temperature is 84 degrees. The overnight low is approximately 90 minutes away. Texas heat is now just background warmth rather than dangerous exposure condition. Everyone who is managing heat stress for hours can finally breathe without feeling like the air is hostile. At 9:50 p.m., the Texas Governor's Office announces that Monday will be declared a day of remembrance for the 36 deceased. State flags will fly at half-staff. Memorial services will be coordinated. The state is acknowledging loss formally and creating space for collective grief alongside the operational response assessment. At 9:52 p.m., I want to address something about Texas that tonight demonstrated clearly. Texas is big. Texas is spread out. Texas has small towns and large cities and vast distances between them. That geography could have made coordinated response impossible. Instead, it created resilience. The small towns absorbed refugees. The large cities provided resources. The distances that normally separate became buffers that limited spread. Texas's size was advantage tonight rather than liability. At 9:55 p.m., the rail rest stop, organized by Robert Hayes, the former Marine, is being featured in national news coverage as the exemplar of civilian crisis response. 216 people secured, 0 breaches, 0 casualties. Professional organization by a civilian who saw a situation that needed leadership and provided it. Robert Hayes is going to be interviewed extensively in coming days about what he did and how he did it. At 9:58 p.m., I'm receiving final updates from DPS about traffic flow restoration. All sections of I-35 from Austin to Dallas are now flowing at or near normal capacity. Some residual congestion from the backlog, but nothing that requires intervention. The highway is operating normally, again just 6 hours and 11 minutes after the closure began. At 10 p.m., we're 6 hours and 25 minutes past the closure start. The crisis that paralyzed I-35 and trapped 350,000 people is now resolved. The highway is open. The infected are neutralized or contained. The casualties have been counted. The shelters are providing overnight support. Texas has transitioned from emergency to recovery. At 10:03 p.m., I'm going to close this continuous broadcast at midnight when the highway achieves complete operational restoration. I've been on air for 6 hours and 21 minutes providing continuous updates. I'm going to stay through midnight because that's when the story has its ending. Not a happy ending, not an ending without loss, but an ending where Texas handled something terrible and prevented it from becoming catastrophic. At 10:05 p.m., the investigation that begins tomorrow is going to examine every decision made tonight. DPS's closure decision, guard deployment speed, local authority coordination, civilian response effectiveness. The investigation is going to identify successes and failures and create recommendations for future highway outbreak response protocols. Texas is going to be the case study for how to handle this scenario. At 10:08 p.m., I want every person who is on I-35 today to hear something from me directly. You survived something that most people will never face. You made decisions in circumstances you weren't prepared for. You stayed calm when calm was difficult. You helped others when helping was possible. You maintained composure during hours that tested composure. You're going home tonight with a story about Texas highways that nobody else has, but that 350,000 people share. At 10:11 p.m., the temperature reaches 83 degrees. The overnight low is 1 hour and 49 minutes away. The Texas night is settling into its typical August warmth. Not cool, not comfortable by other standards, but manageable and survivable, and ordinary in the way that ordinary feels extraordinary after extraordinary circumstances. At 10:13 p.m., the shelters are transitioning to overnight operations. Lights dimming, people settling, children sleeping, families huddled together, processing what they went through. Austin, Temple, Georgetown, Round Rock. The cities that absorbed highway refugees are providing overnight hospitality and planning for tomorrow's coordination of getting everyone home. At 10:16 p.m., Colonel Rodriguez provides his final operational statement for tonight. All guard objectives achieved. All clearing operations complete. All secured areas released to civilian authority. Guard presence transitioning to standby support if needed, but active operations concluded. The military response is officially complete. At 10:18 p.m., I've been monitoring this frequency since 3:47 p.m. I've provided continuous information for 6 hours and 31 minutes. I've coordinated with DPS and Guard and local authorities. I've given 350,000 people information they needed when they needed it. And I'm going to stay on this frequency for 1 more hour and 42 minutes until midnight when the highway fully reopens and the story reaches its conclusion. At 10:21 p.m., Texas held I-35. The highway is open. The outbreak is contained. The state responded professionally. 36 people died, and 349,964 people survived. Both numbers matter. Both are part of tonight's accounting. At 10:23 p.m., I'm going to continue broadcasting through midnight I'll provide traffic updates. I'll share shelter information. I'll coordinate final operational status. And at midnight, when I-35 is fully functional again, I'll close this broadcast knowing that Texas made it through its worst highway crisis in state history. Hello, listener. Interstate 35 is open. Texas survived. And when the sun comes up tomorrow at 6:43 a.m., the highway is going to look like it always looks. 200 miles of asphalt carrying Texas commerce and Texas people between Austin and Dallas like it's done for decades. This is K's 96.7 FM. We were here when you needed information. We'll be here tomorrow when you need it again. Stay safe, Texas. Drive carefully. And remember that 350,000 people proved tonight that even the worst traffic jam in history is survivable when people make smart decisions together.